Horatio Nelson's probably finest tactical masterpiece, and that'll be the Battle of the Nile.
Indeed. Before we get to that, John has a little disclaimer that we have to go over.
The views are those of the author and the speaker in this case and do not reflect the official policy or position of the Department of the Navy, the Naval War College, the Department of Defense, the Department of the Army, or the U.S. government.
Very good. Thank you for that. And I have a little message to my audience that I want to share. If you're interested in John's books, specifically what we're going to talk about today, I recommend you check out the Army University Press website. You can find a book, 16 Cases of Mission Command. John was kind enough to share this with us, and he wrote a chapter within there that we're going to talk about today, the Battle of the Nile. So if you want to get a free download of this book, just go to the Army University Press's website. Now, we are going to talk about what is considered one of the worst defeats in French naval history. Why is this battle such a lopsided affair for the British?
We have to recall that the British had a long period of tactical dominance over every navy during the war. The problems that the Royal Navy had in the last big war, the War of the American Revolution, where they fought not only the American colonists but the Spanish, the Dutch, and the French. The Royal Navy had a tough time in that fight. So the British had fixed a lot of the problems that they'd had with the Navy. And so the Royal Navy that the French are going to meet up with in August of 1898 at the Nile, or in Aboukir Bay. We call it the Nile, but it's really the Battle of Aboukir Bay. It just come off some major victories that against the French Navy. Admiral Howe had defeated them at the Battle of at the glorious 1st of June. They smashed a Spanish fleet. Actually hadn't annihilated it, but crippled it. Nelson was at that battle, the Battle of St. Vincent. And even more important, a battle that doesn't get much look at is the Battle of Camperdown, where they smashed the Dutch fleet. And I mean, really smashed the Dutch fleet. And poor Admiral Duncan doesn't get much credit for that. And then they'd survived the Great Spithead and Nore mutinies. So the Royal Navy had kind of weathered the worst storms, and it was still not completely dominant, but pretty much have its own way wherever it showed up. And again, this particular circumstance, we're going to talk about it. Again, this is the Royal Navy at its best, and it's not quite the French Navy at its worst, but we're going to see the circumstances of the battle are going to give the French absolutely every disadvantage they could possibly have. So you'd have to be a genius of a French admiral to have actually won this battle. And we'll talk about that. How do you avoid this? How do you avoid this kind of catastrophic defeat? That's one of the questions.
Right. And we'll get to that. But to give some background on the French Navy on the other side of the lines at the time, much of their officer corps during the French Revolution had emigrated, been guillotined, or discharged because they were usually from aristocratic stock. Does this explain some or all of what happened here in Egypt?
Not completely, but it helps. And we'll talk about that in a second, why. But the bigger problem was the breakdown of discipline in the French Navy. So the French Navy just falls apart. Most of its officer corps flees, not all of it, and the guys in command at the Nile is one of the ones who stays. But the discipline in the French Navy just absolutely breaks down. And the ships aren't maintained. You basically are putting a bunch of amateurs in charge who don't know what they're doing. And so you lose all of that. So discipline and training just get totally broken down. And for all its great traditions, the attempts to constitute the French Navy had essentially failed. The French Navy, kind of ends the American Revolution on a bad note in a battle that Nelson studies, that all British admirals and captains study, and which Nelson will try to repeat at the Nile. And that's the Battle of the Saints, where Rodney takes a British fleet into shoal water and smashes the fleet of the Comte de Gras. This is the same fleet that actually defeats the British at the Battle of the Chesapeake and results in our independence. But this same French fleet goes on to be pretty much destroyed by Admiral Rodney, who very much is sort of the model for all British admirals, which is kind of aggressive, arrogant, and willing to do sort of unusual things to achieve a victory. And Rodney, once he gets the fleet in the Caribbean, he does that. So the Battle of the Saints, which is just a classic naval battle. But again, the Battle of the Saints, there's problems with it. They probably should have destroyed more French ships than they did. And a lot of British admirals are asking that question, like, how could that have been an even bigger victory than it was? Well, the victim of that battle is the French fleet. And so this is the same French fleet that's overtaken by Revolution in 1789. And it's a fleet that's not going to be able to do much of anything. It tries to at the glorious 1st of June, and it suffers for its temerity in taking on Howe at that battle.
Yeah. Well, let's jump ahead to kind of how we get to Egypt and how Napoleon is landed here in Egypt and why this battle takes place. It must be remembered that Napoleon's not yet in charge of the French government at this point. This is August 1798. I know Napoleon wanted to strike at the British Empire in some way. And I know that the French Directory government just wanted to get this guy as far away from Paris as possible due to his popularity. So it's a two-part question. How does he get approval to invade Egypt? And do you think Napoleon had a chance of succeeding in Egypt before the Battle of the Nile took place?
I'm going to answer the second question first, and then I'm going to go to the first question, then come back to the second question.
Okay.
So my answer to the could Napoleon have ever been successful, or could the French Republic have ever been successful with this expedition? My answer is Clausewitzian, and one never knows. You just never know. The sheer scale and ambition of this operation, which are not just Napoleon's idea, but the Republic's idea, are unprecedented. It's astonishing. When the British finally kind of figure out what it is the French are doing, they're flabbergasted. This is the craziest thing that they're trying to do. It's threatening the empire. It's threatening our lines of communication through the Levant and to our cash cow. At the same time, the French are trying to get the Tipu Sultan to revolt in India. So this is all part of a grand strategy to really attack the British Empire. It's really France's only enemy, and France has no way of directly attacking Great Britain other than invasion. And in 1797, the threat of invasion is obliterated by all of these victories at St. Vincent and then at Camperdown. So, and even the mutinies, which offer a narrow window, don't work to the French advantage just because the French aren't ready to take advantage. So this is the French are actually trying to solve their problem. How do we get Great Britain to admit defeat, right, without invading Great Britain? We attack India, and we attack our sea lines of communication with India. The fact that the French would do this the way they did it just kind of stuns the British. Now, we got to remember, the British had sort of abandoned the Mediterranean to the French. They're maintaining a blockade on Cadiz with essentially the Mediterranean fleet. So there is no fleet blockading Toulon. The French kind of got the feel that, hey, cat's away, let's let the mice play. There's a couple quotes I want to read to you here about this. Yep. St. Vincent, Admiral Jarvis says to Evan Nepean about this, what an extraordinary people these are. No plan is too vast for their undertaking, and the magnitude of their operations confound and dismay all their adversaries, except, of course, us, the British, which is the British way of saying, we can see why the French are kicking everybody's butt, because the scale of their undertakings are so vast. And so, this does get Napoleon out of Paris, but it also addresses the problem of how do we end this ruinous war with Great Britain. Now, the Directory, I'm not going to give the Directory more credit than they deserve. And again, remember, there's been a counter-revolution, then there'll be a counter-revolution, but the Directory so far has been the most stable government the French have had. So this is a group project. It makes perfect sense to put Napoleon in charge of it. Napoleon wants to be in charge of it. As Jonathan Abel famously said, if you want to be a god, where do you go? You go to Egypt. Caesar went to Egypt, came out a god. Napoleon is going to go to Egypt. So Egypt is where gods are made, and Napoleon knows that. So the other thing here is Paul Schroeder's analysis of why the French do this. And he says it was essentially a fundamental impulse followed by a weak and divided government for domestic more than foreign policy reasons without serious calculations in its feasibility and its likely results. So this is Paul Schroeder's sort of wordy way of saying if ever an expedition deserved to fail, it was this one, because nobody did what we call the FAS test on it. Is this feasible, acceptable, and suitable? So the thing that was always fascinated me about the Egyptian expedition is how well it actually manages to do in the face of all these sort of challenges. The French managed to get a pretty big, capable army into Egypt, and they begin to try to make a self-sustaining colony. And if that happens, it's a real problem for the British.
Yeah, it's quite miraculous. Napoleon's fleet, he has 30,000 troops, 10,000 sailors, and manages to evade Nelson's fleet in the Mediterranean and disembark near Alexandria, Egypt. Now, we know all about Nelson just from his fame. Who was Napoleon's naval commander, this Brueys? What do we know of his abilities?
Okay, let's talk about Brueys. He's not your typical French admiral, all right? He is of the nobility. His full name is Francois Paul Comte de Brueys-Aguillet, all right? So, and he comes from a noble province in the south of France, Provence, which is where most of the French admirals and French officers tend to come from, both in the old regime fleet and in the revolutionary fleet. And he naturally becomes a sailor. Initially, he's enlisted. He's not a Marine, which is a sailor. He's a Marine Guard, which is like a Marine. Okay, so basically, he's part of the ship's police force, right? So he's like the way we would think of Marines. And then eventually, he gets commissioned, and he rises quickly in the service, and eventually is in command of a ship of the line under de Grasse at the Battle of the Chesapeake Capes. And so he's involved in one of the great French naval victories of history. He is also there, of course, when the British smashed the fleet at the Saints. So he doesn't have the excuse that he's never had to fight a battle in shoal water before. And the Battle of Aboukir Bay is going to be a battle in shoal water. So Brueys, better than anybody, knows the challenges of fighting a fleet when you're limited in your ability to maneuver. And we'll go into that a little bit more. His family, fascinatingly, they were from Martinique, and they were very close to the Beauharnais family. So he was friends with Josephine. And when he meets Napoleon in 96, he's in command of the Adriatic squadron for the French, which the French are kind of maintaining tenuously in the Adriatic. And he meets Napoleon Bonaparte, probably in Venice, I think. And he becomes an instant devotee, becomes very devoted to Napoleon, even though he's much his senior, he's a noble and everything, but he totally joins Club Napoleon, right? And just totally in favor of him. And so he's actually, and I have this line in my notes, he's the closest thing that the French have to a fighting admiral.
And I think that's what I wanted to point out. He's a nobleman. He's probably well educated. He's not a fool. He didn't get his admiral baton working his way up through the merit system like some of Napoleon's marshals. This is like a trained naval officer. So, and we'll get to the blame game in a little bit. I just wanted to point out that he wasn't some fool.
No, he's. I mean, if you're going to have somebody in command, there's only one other admiral that I can think of in the French fleet, and that's Latouche-Treville, that you'd want in command, right? And Brueys actually had a better relationship with Napoleon. After this is all over, Latouche-Treville will become the head of the French Navy, who's the other fighting admiral in the French Navy.
Right. Well, the harbor in Alexandria, Egypt, proves to be inadequate for this large fleet, so Napoleon orders Brueys to anchor in Aboukir Bay, which is a shallow and exposed anchorage. I don't want to get into the blame game just yet. I'll save that for the end. But who is at fault for the upcoming naval disaster, Napoleon or Brueys?
All right. Well, I am going to say that the balance of the blame is going to have to go to Brueys, and I'll talk about that.
Okay.
But Napoleon does get some of the blame. But what happens, and again, according to Roger Knight, one of Nelson's more recent biographers, the relationship between Napoleon and Brueys, by the time the army has landed, has broken down. So the relationship between the two men breaks down. But there's a lot of stuff that we have to talk about before we to kind of pin the tail on the donkey here. Part of your question here was, how does Napoleon's fleet, how does this invasion fleet and its accompanying escort fleet of these 13 ships of the line with frigates, avoid being detected by the British? And for that, we've got to go back to Nelson being picked to command. So the first thing you have to understand is why do the French get to Alexandria with the army completely intact and unloaded without being attacked by Nelson? And the first thing you have to remember, the British know something's up, but they don't know what is up. The British had no idea this is what the French had planned to do, that they had planned to invade Egypt. They thought maybe the French are going to Corsica, maybe they're going to invade Sicily. They've got designs. They've signed this kind of peace treaty with the Kingdom of Naples, which they'll violate while this is all going on, and eventually they'll chase the decrepit Bourbons out of Naples. So this takes the British by surprise, right? Now, just prior to this, Jarvis is in command of the Mediterranean fleet, which is not in the Mediterranean, it's in the Atlantic off Cadiz. And so he knows he needs to send somebody into the Med to look. So he actually asks for Nelson to be assigned to him, and he cuts him loose with 3 ships of the line and 3 frigates. His orders are basically conduct a quick reconnaissance of the French in Toulon. We hear something's going on. We don't have any information. Our intelligence isn't really clear about what the French are up to. So it's basically a reconnaissance in force by Nelson just to see what's going on. Nelson sails up there with his small squadron. Now, these 3 ships, there's the Vanguard, which is his flagship. And then the other 2 ships are under 2 of the best captains in the British Navy, Sir Thomas Trowbridge and Saumarez. And these two guys are very, very senior captains. Either one of them could be an admiral, and I think both of them will make admiral. In fact, Trowbridge will go on to go very, very high. And so he goes up there with like 2 of Jarvis's best captains. They hit a storm, and Nelson aboard Vanguard almost runs aground in Sardinia. I mean, it's a really bad storm. So they don't really figure out what's going on with the French, and they're distracted by this storm. At the same time, Jarvis decides something's really going on. I don't know what it is. Nelson needs my support. And he sends another 11 ships of the line to Nelson. And these are his best ships of the line under his best captains. It's like, I'm going to pick the all-star team.
Yeah, the Band of Brothers, right?
You're right. And this is when the Band of Brothers begins. But the credit here should also go to Jarvis. Jarvis is the guy who picks all the talent, including the head talent, which is Nelson. Nelson later calls this his Band of Brothers. He comes to love this squadron more. This happens in the Navy. I mean, there are certain ships that I just loved being on. The John F. Kennedy. I loved being a part of that team. When I was on the America with Air Wing 1, I loved being on that ship. And this is for Nelson. This was his favorite squadron of all time. Was the squadron that Jarvis gives him. Now, one of the big problems with the storm, though, is that it scatters Nelson's frigates. And so he has no frigates. So he has this 14 battleship squadron. He's got a brig under Hardy, who's later his captain on the Victory. So what happens here? Nelson finally gets the whole fleet together, and he goes towards the Eastern Med, and at the same time, the French seize Malta. So Napoleon does this unexpected thing and manages this brilliant coup in seizing Malta. Now, that'll play a role later on. We'll talk about that. But that throws off Nelson's calculations. And once he gets the whole fleet together just south of the Straits of Messina, which is between southern Italy and Sicily, he will ask his 4 senior captains, Saumarez, Foley, Trowbridge, and there was one other captain, Ball, Alexander Ball. He basically says, where do you think the French fleet is going? He goes, they could go here, 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 or Egypt, which would do us the most harm, and then that's where I think they're going. And he asked in writing for what they thought. They all went, yeah, boss, he's going to Alexandria. So he sails the whole fleet to Alexandria. Well, Napoleon's just kind of leisurely finishing up at Malta, loads the fleet back up. They go north of Crete. So Nelson sails so fast, he gets to Alexandria before Napoleon gets there, and he goes, we guessed wrong. And so he doesn't stick around. If he had stuck around, he probably would not have only destroyed the French fleet, he would have destroyed the French army. He might have killed Napoleon. In fact, chances are he would have killed Napoleon because the way the British ships fight these battles is just lethal. I mean, it's Napoleon being Napoleon. He's one of these guys who's out there in the midst of battle in his uniform, kind of like Nelson. So
Yeah.
it's hard to imagine Napoleon would have survived, but he might have. So the French fleet gets there and they unload the whole army. And Nelson goes all the way back to Sicily and he hears Napoleon has captured Malta and left Malta. Without any hesitation, he sets off with his 14 ships of the line and his brig under Hardy for Alexandria.
Well, yeah, and it's interesting because, Nelson's probably pulling his hair out trying to figure out where this giant French fleet is. So when we get to this point here in a minute, you can see why when he finally found him, he just said, let's attack. We're not waiting anymore. We're going right in.
Right. So, and on the cruise, both the first time to Alexandria and the second time to Alexandria, and I talk about it in the Mission Command chapter, the Mission Command book, Nelson, there were a couple of his captains that he didn't know very well. Like 3 of them he only knew by reputation. The rest of them he personally knew. But he would bring them on board, particularly the 4 biggies, Ball, Saumarez, Foley, and Trowbridge. He'd bring those guys on board and talk to them about what he wanted to do in the battle, how he wanted to fight the battle, how much he trusted their judgment. And this is going to be a battle that's really a team win, not a single win by any one man. Nelson's in overall command, but he does this thing called decentralized command. He's going to give his captains all kinds of authorities to do all kinds of things. Now, he'll give them some specific, simple guidance, which he always does with flag signals. But he let them know his idea was, we may attack the French fleet as soon as we arrive. They all knew that, and they were all prepared for that.
Yeah, and I know my listeners hate when I compare Napoleon to Nelson, but I think that's how they were similar. I'm going to give you the what to do. The how to do is on you guys. I'm going to delegate that to you, but here's what you have to do. You figure out how.
Yeah, like with Davout and Soule and all those guys at Austerlitz, it's like, no, you handle that. You handle the flank march. You handle seizing the Pratzen and Heights. I'm not going to give you a direct.
Right.
I'm just going to tell you when to go, and then you go. Right? Yeah.
Right. Well, this is the tricky part now. We're going to get into how the 2 naval forces are set up as the battle begins. Aboukir Bay has rocky shoals and is protected by cannons and mortars from a nearby fort. How does Brueys position his 13 ships of the line?
Okay, so Brueys, by this time, the relationship with Napoleon is broken down. I could never find whether he asked Napoleon to actually leave with the fleet so that he wouldn't be caught in a disadvantaged position against a lee shore, which is what happens. Now, a lee shore is the shore that's downwind, right? It's not upwind. So he's worried about that. But I don't know if he ever asked Napoleon if he could leave, but that probably would have been his best move, was to just take the fleet away and try to evade the coming thunderbolt from Nelson. So he anchors, and it's said that some of his captains tried to persuade him to anchor closer in. He does let his frigates anchor closer in, but he keeps his ships of the line a little further offshore. Inside the actual harbor itself, there was not room for all these ships, but he almost certainly could have anchored much closer to the shore than he did. So the anchorage position that he chooses is flawed. And it basically goes from west to east in a sort of line that's going from the northwest, west-northwest to south-southeast. So it's a long line of 13 battleships, and then the 4 French frigates are inside that in another line. And on the other side of the French frigates is absolutely shoal water. You'll run aground there, right?
Right.
So they're marking that. So that's probably where Brueys should have anchored. And so he doesn't take his captain's advice. There's some discussion that Napoleon denies him permission to do that. I don't think that ever happened. I think it was Brueys was concerned that he might run some of his ships aground just trying to anchor that close. So he anchored as close as he thought he could safely get away with, given the skill of his crews. Now, this is all before the British show up.
Right. So Nelson finally gets a fix on the French Navy's position. He sees them sitting there in a straight line, single file. How many ships does Nelson have, and what is his strategy of attack?
So the British have 14 ships of the line, 14 battleships. The French have 13, but the French have the weight of metal on their ships. They have bigger ships with more guns, right? Including the biggest ship, Brueys' flagship is L'Orient, which is a 120 gun first rate ship of the line, one of the biggest, most massive ships in the world. And it'll do some damage in this battle. I mean, one of the British ships of the line will be out of position, and two broadsides from the L'Orient will just practically destroy that ship, the Bellerophon. So he's got the weight of metal. The problem is many of his gun crews are helping Napoleon ashore. Now, first you'd go, who puts their gun crews ashore when they think they might get attacked by the British fleet? Well, remember, Napoleon had asked for these artillerists. He's having problems finding, there's attrition. Where do you go when you need artillery and you're the French? You go to the French fleet and get these unemployed gunners off the ships. So he's actually beefed up his army with some of these really good artillery gunners from the French fleet. And again, they're anchored in this line of 13 ships. And so they don't think anybody can go on the inside, between the inside of the French line and the shoal water, even though 4 French frigates have done that, right?
Right.
So that space of water, which is probably about at most, at its widest, maybe 1,000 meters, difficult to navigate and sail around on a sailing ship with contrary winds around shoal water and that. So this is like a seaman's nightmare here. So Brueys is like, nobody would be stupid enough to go, but so he doesn't need those gun crews. So he's got his gun crews just on the outward, northward facing part of the line. So here are my hands, that's his line. And so all the gun crews are facing that way, which makes perfect sense,
right?
Given what Nelson is planning on doing, actually.
Yeah, for my listeners, it's basically one French line being enveloped by 2 British lines of boats.
And how that happens is fascinating. So Nelson shows up in the late afternoon of August 1st, right? So Nelson, hell for leather, he's talked to his guys, he shows up, there's the French fleet, and he sends 2 signals to his fleet. The first one is prepare for battle. Okay. The second signal is one of the most astonishing signals ever sent in naval history, and will be until we get to Trafalgar. That is prepare for battle and prepare to anchor by the stern. So Nelson and Jarvis, I think, had both studied Rodney at the Saints. And they said, well, the big problem was that the ships, couldn't stay stationary. They had to keep moving. What if they anchored next to their victims and just pounded them to splinters? So Nelson is going to have his ships sail into this line and then anchor opposite each of their intended targets. The British have to move these heavy anchors, heavy ropes, back to the stern of their ships. They don't keep the anchors in the stern. So they're doing this while they're sailing. The sailors have to be good at this. As it turns out, about 10 of Nelson's ships are going to do this maneuver almost, and this is one of the most difficult things to do. They're going to have the wind at their backs, they're going to be moving forward, and they're going to drop anchor, and it's just a really difficult complex. When he sends this signal, the British captains all know what they're supposed to do. So they sail in from the north, and Foley is kind of leading the charge, decide to sail behind the French line. So here's the French line. They sail behind the French line into the no-go shoal water, and so they double the French fleet, and then they execute the anchoring maneuver as a doublet.
Well, here's what must have been very scary if I'm a French sailor on those French ships. 1, half of the gun crews are on the beach, so they can't help me. And 2, this isn't just a strafing run. If they're dropping anchor, that means they're going to stay there and try and kill us all day, all night long. They're not going anywhere. It must have been very scary.
Yeah, his captains had been told to choose their victims. And so this is like, well, couldn't you end up with too many ships on one ship and then other ships? So the British are all watching what they're doing. They're watching each other. Nelson sends the signal, everybody who hasn't already followed Foley and Ball, follow me. And he achieves this almost perfect doubling maneuver. And then they anchor. And yeah, the French are like astonished by what takes place. They're like, oh no. The Bellerophon tries to anchor on the northern side of the Lorient. It mishandles the anchoring evolution, and while it's doing that, the Lorient sends 2 broadsides, essentially 120 guns worth of metal, and Bellerophon drifts out of the battle and is out of the battle. So the battle actually doesn't start out well for Nelson because of what happens to the Bellerophon. But his guys on the inside almost immediately begin to rake the French, and then Alexander Ball puts himself between the Lorient and the ship in front of the Lorient, the Tonnant. All right. So he actually anchors with the line split, kind of like we'll see at Trafalgar where they'll penetrate the line. And then he begins to do some fascinating things, and we'll talk about that. But the French just kind of freak out. Nelson famously states, before the battle, before this time tomorrow, I shall have gained a peerage or Westminster Abbey. So he's totally confident that he's going to destroy this French fleet, and that the British king will make him a lord, will make him a noble.
Or die trying.
And and his captains are of the same mind. They're all going to do this. Okay. And these 2 guys, Foley and Ball, do the most damage of any of the British captains. Alexander had penetrated the line, and he prepared special combustible grenades. And he gets close enough to the Lorient that he throws them into the admiral's quarters at the back of the Lorient and sets it on fire. And then he just starts pouring canister and grape into the fire. The Lorient catches fire. Now, this is right after she's destroyed the Bellerophon. The sun is sinking. It's getting dark.
Yeah.
Everybody up and down the line can see that the Lorient's badly on fire and it's going to blow up. And the battle dies down as everybody battens down the hatches for the mother of all ship explosions, which occurs. Now, prior to Lorient blowing up, Brueys is killed by a cannonball. So he actually dies fighting. He even says, I'm going to die fighting. One of his captains says, should we pull anchor and set sail? He goes, no, I'm going to die fighting. And he does.
Yeah, the blast was so horrific that both sides stopped firing for 10 minutes because of the shock and awe of the destruction. But the fighting picks up again. Again, this is in the middle of the night. This is now like, I think, 1 a.m. And some of the French fleet escapes, right? This isn't a total loss.
No, but it's about as close to a total loss as you can get. The debris, flaming debris from the Lorient, sets both the British and the French ships on fire. So the battle dies down as all these ships try to put out these fires so they don't all get blown to smithereens. And astonishingly, Ball's ship, the Alexander, is the one that's set most badly on fire by the explosion because she's the closest.
Right.
It takes about 2 hours for all the French and British crews to put out the fires, and then they go back to pounding each other. But remember, the inner line of the British ships, there's nobody pounding back against them.
Mm-hmm.
And so about 3 or 4 in the morning, the commander of the van is Admiral Pierre Villeneuve. And he's commanding the 3 leading ships of the line. And he says, that's it, I've had enough. He only gets 2 of the ships of the line away, plus 2 of the 4 frigates. So 2 of the 4 frigates are destroyed. So he gets away with 2 ships of the line and 2 frigates. Now, Why does he get away? Well, Nelson on Vanguard is wounded in the head. In fact, initially he's knocked out. He's bleeding so badly, they think he's dead. So after this battle, we always think of Nelson, he's missing an arm, he's missing an eye. Well, Nelson's never the same. He gets traumatic brain injury. He has these horrible headaches for the rest of his life from the wound he receives at the Nile. Hardly anybody ever talks about his wound at the Nile. I mean, there's some discussion that he'll never fight again because of this wound.
Yeah, and I'm glad you pointed that out. And the name Villeneuve, if you get my audience, you'll hear that name again.
And
down the road.
So Villeneuve gets away because Nelson is effectively not, and Nelson had failed to appoint somebody to be second in command. So essentially, after he's wounded, which is right around the time the Lorient blows up, these captains fight the battle without Nelson's guidance at all. But Nelson has set them up for success. He's sort of envisioned how the battle's going to go, but they execute the battle almost perfectly.
The fighting gradually dies down as more and more French ships strike their colors and surrender. So what were the ship losses on both fleets? We'll get to the actual casualties in a minute.
So 11 ships of the line are captured or destroyed. So
On
essentially,
the French side.
on the French side. So the bulk of the French fleet is destroyed. This is not quite as big of a victory as Camperdown over the Dutch. Again, the ships are much bigger, more prestigious. I mean, this is the cream of the French Navy that Nelson has just destroyed. The best captains, the best admiral, the best crews in the French Navy are destroyed. These 2 frigates and 11 battleships. And again, this is mostly a night battle. So when the sun finally comes up, the final 2 French ships are just being pounded to pieces by the British, and they finally strike their colors.
Yeah. On the British side, I know that Bellerophon, did they lose any other ships? I know one ran aground.
So Trowbridge's ship runs aground and Bellerophon, but none of the British ships are sunk. They're all damaged. Just about every single British ship is damaged, which is a testimony to the French. When you hear the casualties, you'll realize this was a hard fight. This was not an easy, cheap victory in any sense of the word. All right. People tend to go, oh, yeah, it was a cheap, nearly bloodless victory. No, it wasn't. It was pretty bloody. Nelson's badly wounded. Several of Nelson's captains are wounded. But none of them are killed. None of the ships sink. But the Bellerophon is probably the worst damage. The one that gives them the biggest problems, of course, is Trowbridge's ship, because it's aground, so they have to pull it out. You mentioned the fort. The fort turns out to be nothing. Too far away to provide any support, and none of the British ships are stupid enough to go near it. The only ship that's in any danger from the fort is Trowbridge's ship. It's aground, and even that ship finds out that there's no threat. So that's the ship. So the British don't lose a ship. The French lose the equivalent of 14 ships.
Okay. On the human side, I know the casualties for the French are quite appalling, losing 2,000 dead or wounded, along with 3,000 prisoners. So basically 5,000 casualties versus just 1,000 casualties for the British. Seaman John Nichols states, quote, "I went on deck to view the state of the fleets, and an awful sight it was. The whole bay was covered with dead bodies, mangled, wounded, and scorched," end quote. So what does this loss mean to Napoleon's Egyptian expedition?
Okay, so almost 1,000 British are killed or wounded in this battle. So the numbers of killed in this battle, though, testify to how horrible it was. 2,200 French killed. I mean, that is just a shocking number. Napoleon's fleet is smashed. Now, I've heard different people talk about the legacy of the Battle of the Nile. The legacy here is France's best general, or best generals, because we're talking about Desailly, we're talking about Napoleon, we're talking about Lannes, we're talking about Murat, we're talking about Davout. So you've got the best generals in the French army, with a couple exceptions.
But they're marooned. They're marooned there.
They're marooned. They're trapped in Egypt. There's no way to pull them out. The only way to get this army back to France is to march through the Ottoman Empire. And Napoleon, bless his heart, he tries. He does. And he gets stymied by another great British naval hero, Sidney Smith, at Acre.
Yeah.
So, and maybe he's thinking, if I could capture Acre, maybe we could sneak a French fleet in there and I could get some of my army away.
And not only can they not be resupplied, where was Napoleon's treasury?
It was on his ship.
Right.
It was on his ships. So he's got all this vast wealth on these ships, much of it plundered from Malta, from the Knights of St. John. How's he going to pay his soldiers,
Right.
And he's lost, and he loses all this prestige with this battle. And the thing that really matters is it emboldens Napoleon's enemies. It's electric. It's almost like what happens after the Battle of Vittoria, when the coalition is like, wow, there's this great British victory in Spain. Well, here's this great British victory in Egypt, and all of a sudden, Austria is back talking to the British again about maybe coming back into the war. And the Russians, when Napoleon seizes Malta, seems like a good idea, but who's the Grand Master of the Knights of St. John? Tsar Paul. And Tsar Paul is incensed. The only way I think the French could have avoided getting the Russians into the war would have been to essentially say, we're just waiting for a Russian fleet to come to Malta and take possession. But
Right.
that's not what the French did. They,
Right.
so the legacy of Malta, which should have been positive, another French base in the Mediterranean, is negative because it brings the Russians into the second coalition. And it also leads the French to be vulnerable. I mean, they've got this really good army in Egypt, and now they're spread thin all over Europe with no more than really 200,000 troops in the active armies. And they've made it worse because they've conquered Naples, and so their armies in Italy are spread, with from the boot of Italy all the way up to the Alps. And so the French armies are vulnerable, and the Allies look at all this, and so the Nile plays a key role in causing the War of the Second Coalition.
Well, let's talk about that because the legacy is tricky. It doesn't end Napoleon's expedition. It doesn't prevent him from becoming emperor. It isn't Nelson's last major victory. You could say Trafalgar's probably more important. And it doesn't end the French Navy's ability to conduct maneuvers. That happens at Trafalgar. So is it a big battle? Absolutely. It's very important, but does it really stop anything? The legacy, it's tricky.
Well, the British are certainly far better off after the Nile
Yep.
than they had been. And the French face probably their most serious crisis with the War of the Second Coalition. So the War of the Second Coalition begins, and the war goes very, very poorly for the French initially. Horrible. All of Napoleon's conquests are lost in Italy, and eventually, the savior that saves France, the three guys that really do the most to save France from this string of catastrophes will be the Minister of War Bernadotte, André Massena in Switzerland, and Brune in the Low Countries. So you'll have all these other guys. If you ever wonder why they all end up becoming marshals, now you know why. They saved France in 1799. So, now Nelson's legacy after this is mixed. Nelson gets a diamond spray from the Ottoman Sultan. He becomes feted. He becomes the first Baron of the Nile. He becomes the rock star of the anti-Napoleon world, right? And he repairs back to Naples, and then he begins his infamous affair with Emma Hamilton. Nelson's great victory is the beginning of sort of a bad period for Nelson.
Yeah.
Where Nelson and then Nelson goes on to add, shame in Naples and
Yep.
hanging the revolutionaries and everything. And so Nelson sort of becomes this embarrassment to the British government at one point, even though they reward him and he's so famous and everything. But again, we have to remember the British have carte blanche now in the Med. The French fleet is not destroyed, but it is crippled. The Spanish fleet and the French fleet, until the Treaty of Amiens is signed, are going to essentially be neutralized by the blockade. So
yeah.
So the legacies here are difficult to, but certainly it's a setback.
Right. And that leads to my final question. And I don't usually like to Monday morning quarterback on this show, but what should have Napoleon and Brueys done with the fleet?
Well, they managed to accomplish the impossible. They evade Nelson and land a hostile army in a critical location, a decisive point along the British line of communication to India. So Napoleon, what could he have done different? I'll talk about that second. Let me talk about Brueys first. Brueys should have set sail. He should have gone back to Malta. I think he could have gotten a whole fleet into Valletta. And now Nelson is going to think twice about trying to get him, right? And go in and destroy the fleet in Valletta. Because Nelson's one big defeat to this point is at Tenerife, where he tried to battle forts and he lost his arm for it. And he also got a relative killed, And so Brueys should have run. Brueys should have just picked up the fleet and said, hey, I'm going to try to get back here when I can, but I'll see you later.
Call us when you need us. Right.
Yeah, they dodged a huge bullet when Nelson outran them and then skedaddled back to Sicily, right? So if that had happened, the battle might not have ever happened. Again, had Nelson had frigates, had he been a little bit more patient, he might have destroyed the army and the navy. Eventually, Abercrombie will come back and finally finish off what's left of the French army a couple of years later. But now, for Napoleon, what could what could he have done different? Again, if he had sent his fleet away, he could have said, okay, we're just going to buckle down here. We're going to go native, and we're going to do everything we can to make our position here as safe as we possibly can. But what does he actually do? He manages to keep in touch with Villeneuve. And then when the time is right, and he's come back from the Acre expedition, and then he defeats another Turkish army at Aboukir Bay, by the way, he will hop on board Villeneuve's ships and scurry back to France for 18 Brumaire.
Without his army.
Without his army, but with a lot of his key helpers.
That's true.
The guy I think about is MacArthur leaving the Philippines, right? He takes his dream team with him, right?
Yeah. Well, and I think 16 Cases of Mission Command, I think that's why it was included in this book. There's a lot of things that could have been done better looking back on it.
Right. And Nelson provides sort of a model for how you command a team of proven professionals. You don't micromanage them. And they go ahead and they win the battle for you, even though you're badly wounded. Yeah, Nelson establishes, enables, and sets the stage with his aggression, his decision, one, to turn around and go back. As soon as he realizes he's been hoodwinked, his decision to go in the first place, so his gut instincts are absolutely correct all the time here. Yeah. And then the way he gets his captains ready for this battle and then turns them loose on the French fleet is a wonder to behold. And anybody who wants to be a great commander should study Nelson's actions prior to his being wounded at the Battle of the Nile. The anchoring maneuver is just astonishing. No other fleet in the world could have done that. Only the British fleet could have done that.
Love that. Yeah. And again, if you want to check it out for free, you can download this. It's is it the Army University Press website?
Army, yeah. So it's 16 Cases of Mission Command. It's at the Army University Press website. Now, there's another book called Great Commanders, and there's a chapter in there on Nelson by me as well. So.
Okay. So check that out as well.
There's a third book called Great Unknown Victories, also free, also from Army University Press. And my chapter in there is on St. Vincent.
Love it. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, John, as always, for joining the show. Really good episode. I learned a lot. And Battle of the Nile.